Okay, so it is 146 BCE, about where we left off in the timeline before we took a brief excursus to Pseudolus and Cato the Elder. And now we're back to the geopolitical system that informs the age of Gracchus and gets us up to date with the docudrama we were watching earlier this semester. So, 146 BCE, I've titled More Money, More Problems because that's kind of the TLDR of what's going on here. So Rome, in the wake of the Third Punic War, and I think by now it was the Fourth Macedonian War, had acquired all of the territory you see here in green, which is a pretty significant amount. You'll notice that the yellow is still pending. The yellow is added by Caesar's conquest by the mid-1st century BCE, which is super duper surprising because Rome is also in the middle of a century of civil war by then. Go figure. How did this work out, and what changes did this put into the Roman system that we're going to see Romans reacting to in the second half of the semester? Stay tuned to follow. We're going to pick up with the Grocky Brothers. The docudrama was about the older one, Tiberius. His, what's the word I'm looking for? Tribunate was in 133 BCE. His little brother Gaius was elected to tribune in 123 and held into 122 and 121. Both of them were assassinated by the mob, as you do. Under the masterminding of the Senate, of course. So both brothers had a similar priority: to relieve urban homelessness and a joblessness crisis by a couple of methods, primary among them debt relief. So the cancellation of debt was meant to allow free landholders to maintain control of their land, and those who were in increasing poverty in the city to get back enough money to get land. There was also a land redistribution scheme in process. None of these things particularly came to fruition, but they're a symptom of a larger problem: increasing homelessness, division between the wealthy and the poor amongst the citizen body, increasing reliance on enslaved labor to run what are essentially large factory farms. When we talk about the villa system, I think a better and increasingly popular translation for villa is plantation, because that's essentially what it is. This is a large managed estate run by enslaved labor, managed by land agents who are themselves also enslaved in this kind of tiered system of exploitation, as it were. And the land is cheap, again, because of the debt and joblessness crisis in the Italian mainland. So the Gracchi were pushing for direct relief of these problems. And in some ways, there's a lot to be said for it. Subsequent generations looked on the Grocky Brothers as prime examples of the best of Roman citizen advocates. So they had a great reputation after they were dead. During their lifetime, not so wonderful, at least among the elites. But even had their legislation gone through, we still would have been in a bit of a crisis, because just land redistribution doesn't solve the inherent problems driving this economic crisis. It also doesn't repatriate the enslaved people that are now pouring into Italy from North Africa, from Spain, from the Greek East, from the Levant, so modern-day Jordan, Syria, and also Anatolia, so the coast of what's now Turkey. There are huge numbers of enslaved people coming in from Roman foreign wars. And had this land been redistributed, those enslaved people would still be there. And these enslaved people do become the next few generations of Romans, as they, through various means, achieve manumission and themselves take on Roman names and Roman identity. So it's an interesting blurring of the lines of exploitation here And also part of why Rome does continue to function is that it creates a way of incentivizing people to cooperate with their own subjugation, essentially. And it also creates a buy-in effect where people who have been victimized by the system feel like they've done their time and they've earned their place and thus have the right to victimize other people in a dynamic that, of course, I'm sure you can't think of any modern parallels for. It's my sarcastic voice. At any rate, two dead Grocky brothers fail to do much to alleviate the crisis, which leaves some territory for a guy named Gaius Marius. So Gaius Marius was elected consul in 107, and you will notice that he's consul to 100. Can someone tell me what's weird about that? How long are you consul for? 1 year. Is that 1 year? It is not. How many years is that? Yeah, 7 years plus an extra. That is not in the rule system. What the hell, Gaius Marius? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to our ongoing economic crisis, because Marius came up with a solution to homelessness that managed to bypass land redistribution in Italy and also feed the Roman military machine. And this is part of the answer to the question of how the hell do you have a century of civil war and still conquer the Mediterranean? This is step one. Now, these changes had already been kind of pioneered and sort of backdoor tested. But it's Marius who gets the Senate to say, yeah, you can totally do this. The first thing that he's generally considered responsible for popularizing, if not inventing, is doing away with the property qualifications for joining the Roman military. So you may recall from a few lectures ago, in order to serve in the Roman military, you had to be a property owner. They thought that land ownership and citizenship status ensured that your primary loyalty would be to the Roman state and that that was necessary to be a good Roman soldier. But by this period, you have a lot of Roman veterans who no longer had land, but they were trained, they had experience, they'd been fighting in foreign wars for generations now. Marius needed to keep them on side to keep an experienced staff together, and he also knew that if he were to get raw recruits from the urban homeless, they would be loyal to him and also loyal to the military. So he starts just forgetting to ask, hey, do you have any property? When he signs people into the Roman military. The reason why he's able to do this is because of an invasion crisis. This is Return of the Gauls, only it's not the Gauls. It's the Cimbri and Teutones. These are people from the Jutland Peninsula, so far northern Europe. Today we'd identify them as Germans. Germans kind of aren't a thing yet. It's complicated. Just go with me here. But crop failures and perhaps some climate change had induced them to do what a lot of northern European people did when the land they were currently occupying was no longer viable or their population exceeded the ability of that land to support them. Namely, they'd pick up stakes, they'd load their families into wagons, and they would go out to conquer some other land, thus displacing people in kind of a domino effect across northern Europe. This has been happening for a while. This is part of the dynamic that informed the Gallic invasions that Brennus was part of back in the early 300s. You remember Brennus, right? The woe be under the vanquished dude, that guy. If you don't remember him, Rome did. So yet again, people from northern Europe had crossed the Alps, were invading Italy, and were winning battle after battle after battle. Several legions had been utterly liquidated. Rome was in bad shape again. It was kind of like Hannibal II, only it's Germans. So they called out Gaius Marius from an active war zone in North Africa. He, at the time, was fighting against a North African king named Jugurtha, king of Numidia. Yeah, Numidia hadn't been happy long-term with the deal they struck with Rome, surprise. And Rome eventually ended up going to war with Numidia as well. So Marius had just been dealing with that. He had veteran troops, real field experience, and he himself was not from the city of Rome proper. He was from an allied Italian state, so he's a little bit of a political outsider, but he had the military know-how to be able to effectively defend Rome from not just an invasion of Germanic peoples, but also a colonizing attempt. These were people with their families and their children who were trying to take Italian land and settle. And as we all know, only upper-class Romans can steal Italian land and settle in it. Awkward. Anyway, that's how Gaius Marius got his initial 5-year term as consul, and then they kept extending it, because he was like, look, guys, it's going to take me more than 1 year to beat these guys. And also, I need to reform the military. So you need to vote me some extra time as consul. And Rome is up against a wall. So they're like, okay, Marius, we'll make a special exception for you, just one-time exception. You can be consul for extra. And we expect you to solve the military crisis. And so Marius, groovy, I got this. Anyway, he starts recruiting without property qualifications, and the Senate is willing to say, yes, go ahead and do that, because the Senate is scared because the Northern Europeans are coming and they're scary. Simultaneously, Marius starts popularizing this move that we're going to see snowball in future generations. So dukes, you may recall, is the word for general. It gives us duke in English nobility eventually. It's a word that's got a long history on it. But for the Romans, this just means general. But he began to lean into this social concept from Roman law that derives not from military terminology, but from civilian terminology, that of patronus. You might recognize this from Harry Potter. It's the same word, only when you say expecto patronum in Latin, your lawyer shows up. It's an upper-class Roman who represents you in court, who vouches for you and sponsors your citizenship. So it's not a glittery deer. It's a Roman in a toga. Not necessarily a dude, though. If it's not a dude, she's not wearing a toga. Anyway, so your military leader now also acts as your patronus, in that he's going to guarantee your pay and your pension once you retire. He's also going to guarantee a set of sign-on bonuses and exit bonuses that are meant to compensate you for your time serving in the military. We're moving from a volunteer citizen military model, and we have been for some time, because Rome's been overseas for multi-year campaigns for a while now. But Marius starts making systemic changes that support that a lot better on the ground, so that when you sign up, you have a signing bonus up front, and you know that when you retire, you're going to be given some land. Ostensibly, generals keep promising, oh, you'll get Italian land, but most of them can only give you land in a country you just conquered, which incentivizes conquest, interestingly enough. Marius's people got farms in southern France, what's now modern Provence, which is pretty nice too, not gonna lie. Of course, this meant displacing a lot of people, but that doesn't stop Rome. At any rate, this solves in one fell swoop both a homelessness crisis and a land ownership crisis without displacing people who have grabbed land in Italy. But it's also kind of kicking the ball down the street a little bit, because there's only so much Mediterranean, and you have to keep conquering Mediterranean to keep paying your army. So this is it's a temporary solution that's not very sustainable, and that's going to be important for later, so keep that in mind. So if your general is your patron, he's the person who's vouching for your financial well-being now and in the future. He's making sure you're taken care of in the field. He's paying for a lot of your supplies now in a way that wasn't the case for the Roman military earlier on. So there's more supplying of the soldiers by the military itself rather than expecting you to bring all your own stuff. That's another big innovation here. Your veterans now become the other half of this civilian social construct. So The Patronus is your patron. He is the more powerful person, or she, who looks out for you, who advocates for you legally, and who ensures that you get what's coming to you. But this isn't a freeloader situation. You are expected, and indeed legally required, to maintain loyalty to your patron. If your patron runs for office, you're expected to vote for them and to help them campaign. If your patron needs a favor, you're going to do it. If they ask you to clean out their gutters, you go clean out those gutters. If they ask you to, I don't know, name your puppy after them or something, you have to do it. So the client end of this is a state of perpetual gratitude and semi-inherited subservience. This relationship is built off the model of manumitted enslaved people. So the first clients were people who had been part of the family as an enslaved member, and on manumission were then made into a quasi-dependent. This is partly how Rome incentivized manumission, because even once you were technically freed, you could still ask that person for free labor, and that's how that worked. Their children would then be Roman citizens, but that relationship would be inherited. You'd keep the family name, and you'd maintain this connection. So it's a way of maintaining some social control over your formerly enslaved people. Little icky. Right, so next up, there was a whole group of people that the Roman military had been cagey about involving as part of its regular troops. And that was folks from Italian city-states that weren't very closely allied with Rome. Marius is an example of somebody from Arpinum, which was an Italian allied state with very strong ties to Rome that included full citizen rights, which is how Marius could run for office in Rome, despite not being from the city of Rome itself. Not all city-states had that relationship with Rome. It was a very case-by-case basis thing. And you may recall this has been a problem in past invasions of Italy, where people like Hannibal and what's his face with the elephants, Pyrrhus of Epirus, tried to get Italian city-states to turn against Rome. In this situation, Marius broadens the kinds of Italian city-states he recruits from, and he starts making them a deal. If you serve with Rome, at the end of your term of service, I'll give you formal paperwork that guarantees your full citizenship as a Roman. So it creates a path to citizenship through military service. This has been a classic ever since, but at the time, this was weird. Rome, previous to this, had relied on a series of allied auxiliary forces. For instance, with the Numidian cavalry, they didn't give the Numidian cavalry citizenship. The Numidian cavalry were a foreign ally that you'd be like, hey, y'all, pretty please, would you come fight with us? And they'd be like, yes, we have treaty obligations. Awesome, we'll come fight with you. And this eventually devolved into the war with Jugurtha when they were like, nah, like, enough of this nonsense. So this creates a new option where you're not just serving Rome because you're an allied state, but you're serving Rome in hope of yourself getting citizenship. And this creates a win-win for Rome, because this means people who've never been to the city of Rome now have citizenship, which means they're invested in the existence of Rome, and they're buying into this idea of Romanness. So it's low-key genius here, this, but not a path to citizenship that we should accept uncritically, I think, because it's still a bit exploitative. Let me explain. The term of citizenship at its heyday, in this early period, it's a little shorter than this, but at its peak, you signed on for 20 years plus 5. So 20 years was your term of service, and then there was an extra 5 at the end as you transitioned out into veteran status. So if you joined in your teens and you lived that long, by the time you retired, you'd be like 40-something, maybe. And you then you weren't also allowed to marry while you were a regular soldier. You had to be an officer to be allowed to be married while you were serving in the military. So this meant a lot of people were waiting into their 40s to be able to legally start a family. They were starting families. They just weren't doing it legally. And those marriages weren't legally recognized or allowed, and they tended to break up when the unit was moved to another site, unless your family up and moved with you, which sometimes happened. So military encampments sometimes had soldiers' illegal families kind of coming along with, which is an interesting dynamic. Eventually, soldiers petitioned for the right to marry and got it, but it took until the 200 CE, so really long time. This is a pretty extreme contract, yes? And this is why I go for the exploitative label here. This is a little questionable. Okay, so if you make it to the end of your service term, and in these early stages, it's more like, 15 to 17 years, which is still like bananas, yes? Nonetheless, at the end of it, Marius himself, so not the Roman state, Marius was like, okay, if you sign on with my unit, then when you retire, I'm going to make sure you get a farm of so many acres as part of your retirement package, and also you're going to get some money, some pensions that I too am going to guarantee. How could he guarantee all of that stuff personally? Well, he just completed a successful invasion of Numidia. He had money. And then he's about to turn this war against the German invasion into a war of conquest that includes the Po River Valley and what's now modern-day Provence within the Roman Empire. So this creates a lot of extra territory that Marius has personally added to Rome that he personally gets to sack, and if you get to sack it, you get to pocket the good stuff. So this is a military situation that incentivizes lots of sacking, lots of keeping what you sack, and extreme loyalty between troops and the general who recruits them. Loyalty to the general, not necessarily loyalty to the state. I'm sure you can begin to see where there might be some problems coming up. So let's see how this panned out. But first, let's move on to another important reform in the Roman legion. Big change here. The triplex acies, the three-line infantry model with the skirmishers in the front, where we had people divided by age and socioeconomic class, had for a long time become increasingly unwieldy and not particularly effective in the field, at least not in the way folks wanted it to be. The maniples were also becoming increasingly fussy and easy to counter. So part of what Marius does here is he scraps the entire threefold line thing. So no more hastati, triarii, principes, that's gone. Instead, the legions are divided into cohorts, and within each cohort there's a mix of experience levels. So each cohort has a mixture of veterans who can train younger soldiers. But within the cohorts, the first cohort, so the enemy will be like here, where the title of the slide is. Let me scribble on the thing, so this is on the recording too. Okay, so the enemy is up here, yeah. The first cohort stands at the most vulnerable place for the enemy line to attack, because that left flank, so if you're attacking this legion, like the left wing of your cavalry is going to be coming at this first cohort. It's the most vulnerable place of your military. So that is where you put your most experienced NCO. Your first spear centurion goes there. Also, your standard bearers, your most experienced, most hard-ass warriors go there. So that's going to be the hardest part of the Roman line to roll up. It's the place that requires the most skill, and that's where Marius puts the most skill. But within the first cohort, you also have younger soldiers who are learning how to do that work really well, so that you can continue to replace from within. And this goes on down to the 10th cohort, which is slightly less experienced, but they're also more protected. They're in this safer place so that we don't bleed people while we're learning how to fight as a good unit. Now, with the cohorts, you can still create staggered lines and move your units around to account for irregularities on battlefield terrain. But for the most part, this puts together the best of a phalanx line with the maneuverability of smaller squadrons. into a formation that scales really well over the larger distances necessary to fight with the huge massed northern European forces that Marius was going up against, or say that Romans were going up against in Numidia as well. Bigger armies are on the field, so we need bigger formations. But we're still keeping some classics. The cavalry are still on either side as wings. That kind of helps us with crowd control on the enemy lines. Another bonus of this formation, we're still putting fresh troops up at the front. Instead of doing it by circulating our maniples, however, we do it within the cohort itself. So every 10 minutes or so, this first line, so I'll go with our first cohort here. So the first line of the first cohort will go back down the file this way, and then the next line will step up. And because you've got skinny tower shields, you can slide by. So you'll have your hand on the person in front of you. That person at the signal will slide back, you'll step up immediately, savvy. And this means that you're able to circulate fresh troops still to the front. So we're doing everything we were doing with the maniples. We're just doing it more effectively and with less stratification amongst the units. This allows us to be more conservative with the loss of people in the field, and it also allows us to make the most out of our most experienced troops in order to more effectively cover ground on the battlefield. Works great. And this is a classic. This is how Rome does its legionary structure for the next several hundred years. It's actually a great one. So keep this in mind if the apocalypse happens, because listen, it works really well. Let's see, anything else I want to say about this? One more thing. So each of these cohorts divides down into 8-person tent groups. We'll talk about those in a minute. But this is not just the order that you fight in. This is also the order that you march in. This is the order that you camp in at night. This is the order that you live in when you're in winter quarters for months on end in enemy territory. So this is essentially a marching town that lives together, eats together, fights together, and creates its own little subculture with your general as your, dare I say, mini-king. So part of the unit cohesion that comes from this recruitment model and from this marching model is that we create this subculture, the sub-society with a political unity that's about to have some massive ramifications in the politics of the city of Rome as well. So another seemingly tiny innovation, but a really important one here, is that the legionary mascot structure changes. So back in the day, each subunit, each maniple would have its own little standard. These standards were considered sacred. They were kept in a shrine at night. There were sacrifices to them, and the pay was kept in a box underneath them so that the gods of the standards would guard them and nobody would steal. This was also used as a motivational tool. So if the battle was going poorly and your centurion wanted to motivate you, they'd take the standard, grab it, throw it into the enemy, and then everybody would like freak out and try to capture the flag back. And then this would create forward movement. But this also created chaos. Yes? Too many standards. So Marius is like, okay, one sacred standard per legion. And it's going to be an eagle because the eagle is the bird of Jupiter and that's the best. So we're going to go with that, eagle. And the eagle was now considered the sacred standard. The mini standards were still around because they were used to deliver orders. You would gesture forward, back, side. The standard was still a useful tech. But only the eagle was the sacred object. And the person who got to carry the eagle, this golden eagle on a stick, I don't think we have any. We might have found one, but we know from art this is what they looked like. The person carrying the eagle would be cosplaying as Heracles. That's why the lion skin, that's a Hercules costume. And this was your most badass soldier you could find because all of the sacredness of the legion was now bound up in this eagle. And if the enemy got the eagle, Rome would lose its ever-loving mind and would go out of its way to get the dang eagle back. So much so that you can trace how bad a military defeat is by whether or not the enemy has the eagle. And non-Romans learned that Romans got really pissed off if you took their eagles, so they'd like brag a lot. And then Rome would send assassins to get the eagle back. It's this whole thing. Capture the flag, only very bloody. But this allowed one object to stand in as the soul of the legion and to serve as a motivational tool when you needed it, but you didn't like splinter that across 15 standards, you just had the one. And it still at night would stand in its tent shrine and protect the pay, and then nobody would steal from the pay chest because Jupiter is watching. You don't want Jupiter to see you stealing. So this worked out pretty well. So this brings us to the next stop on our tour of 1st century BCE crises. That is the social wars, which doesn't sound like a great name for a war. Yes, this sounds like something that happens in a Jane Austen novel. It's not, though. So the social wars was the War of the Socii, which is the Latin word for allied states, specifically Italian allied states. This map has them color-coded, so the ones who were sticking with Rome are kind of in bluey, tealy colors, and then the pink ones were sort of fighting against Rome, and I'm saying sort of fighting against Rome because this is a weird-ass war. Because the people going to war in the social wars were not fighting Rome for independence. They were fighting Rome because they wanted full citizen rights. So they're fighting a war to join Rome. Bananas, right? But nonetheless, so this is one of the few civil wars that's about we want to join, and Rome's like, no, man. They're like, yes, man. Yeah, so these go from 91 to 88 BCE. And these are the things that all Italian allied states wanted from the city of Rome. So they wanted full citizenship, which meant the following. You have the right to vote, but also to run for office. So you can both vote for your representatives, and you yourself can someday be a senator. Only a few Italian states had this right at the beginning of the social wars. Next up, the right to have the state ratify and defend your marriage, which may seem like a bit of a weird one, but part of what this does is that it means automatically your children inherit. So the state puts in some automatic inheritance measures for your children, and if somebody tries to run off with your stuff, the state kind of intervenes a little bit. So that's important. And if the state recognizes your marriage, this means like some other random lady can't be like, no, I'm his real wife, and like you don't have a record so you can't prove it. So this is an important service that the city of Rome is being asked to provide for everybody in Italy. And Rome's like, we don't have that kind of space. And they're like, make that kind of space, Rome, or else. Next up, they wanted the right to freely migrate around the Italian peninsula, to switch hometowns without a lot of administrative friction. It's the same genre of rights that we now have in the United States, where you can go from state to state freely without papers, and you can essentially move between state lines, and interstate commerce isn't being impeded by it. So this is a similar thing that the Italian allies are wanting, because since Rome has a different legal deal with each individual city-state, if you move to like a state 5 miles away, you might find yourself with a completely different trade law that you're dealing with, and it's very annoying. Next up, local immunity when you're abroad. So what I mean by this is that if you get into a legal problem and you're outside of Italy, say you're doing business in Corinth. Actually, no, Corinth isn't a thing. Rome has destroyed it by now. Yeah, they do the Carthage to Corinth as well. All the stones pulled apart, totally gone at this point. So say you're in Numidia and you want to make a business deal, and you get arrested for, I don't know, insulting somebody's horse. If you have full Roman citizenship, you can petition the locals and say, hey, y'all, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't punish me. You've got to send me back to Rome, and they'll punish me. And then they have to. The one time that this didn't happen, so King Mithridates of Pontus, we'll meet him in a minute, but one night he decided to kill all of the Roman citizens living inside of his kingdom, and then Rome started a war over it. So everybody else was like, I want Rome to start a war if somebody murders me in Numidia. So they're petitioning for that, and Rome is like, gosh, there's a lot of you. That's kind of a lot, guys. And they're like, tough cookies. We went in. Court access is another thing. So the courts at Rome had an open access system where you could petition Roman law to redress your case. And if you were a citizen, you got preferential treatment. And if you were going to court against a non-citizen, extra preferential treatment. So court access was important. If you weren't a citizen, you couldn't go to Roman court to sue a Roman very easily. You needed like a Roman patron to vouch for you. So if you have citizenship, you can sue people for not paying or for, I don't know, harassing your dog, which you can't harass people's dog if they're chained up in their yard, just so you know. Also, you're not allowed to put bear pits in the middle of roads. Keep that in mind. Right, next up, the right to appeal. So if you're found guilty of a crime in the provinces, even under Roman law, so if you're a Roman citizen, you get charged with a crime in, say, Africa Proconsularis or Sicily. You go before the Roman governor. The Roman governor tries you. He's like, look, dude, you're guilty. You can say, I'm a Roman citizen. I request an appeal in Rome. And they have to do it. They have to send you to Rome for your appeal. This is an important one to keep in mind because one of our future characters is going to pull that card. And it's the Apostle Paul. So keep that one in mind. It's a useful thing to have in your pocket. Also, by the way, if you're a Roman citizen, no crucifixion ever. You don't want crucified. It's very unpleasant. Okay. About that, bodily protection is also on the table. So there are certain capital punishments that are off the table if you're a Roman citizen. I mean, you could still get capitally punished, but some of the really long-lasting, painful ones, like crucifixion, are off the table. You're not allowed to be routinely tortured as part of the court fact-finding process, which seems like... But again, keep in mind, pre-modern legal systems were very pro-torture. So Roman citizenship gives you some torture protection. I strongly recommend getting torture insurance. And then also, if you're accused of treason, automatically you're sent to Rome for it. Now, this send you to Rome for your trial thing may not seem like a huge perk, but keep in mind that Roman courts were often much more friendly to Roman citizens than were anybody else's courts, which means that these are significant perks. The interesting thing about the social wars, the Italian allies lost the war but gained their citizenship rights. So they kind of lost and they kind of won. They lost the war, but then Rome was like, you know what, actually, we'll give you some rights. And eventually these rights get extended to the Italian mainland, in part because Rome realized we can't keep on this way with the Italian allies mad at us because foreign invaders keep using this as a lever to try to flip people on Rome. So, we're just going to suck it up, and we're going to make Rome kind of a pan-Italy, full enfranchisement situation. But just Italy. That doesn't last forever, but at this point, it's just Italy. So about this service and citizenship connection, this is a military diploma. And this is what you would get if you had served in the Roman military and gotten your citizenship as part of fulfilling all of the terms of duty. And this is a mass diploma, so at the bottom it's got a number of veterans' names, all of them put onto it. This one is in bronze, and it would be posted up in the local township that the Legion was serving in. And then this gave you some paperwork that you could point to and be like, hey, this is my proof of citizenship, I'm a citizen now. And this is good enough. You could also carry copies with you, and people did do that. But this is what you got. And we have a lot of these surviving from the ancient world. You would also get one of these if you were manumitted as part of the enslavement system in Rome. and it would have your new Roman citizen name, and it would be proof of citizenship for your children. So if you had been manumitted, you don't get full citizenship, so you don't get voting rights, but you do get the right to marry, and your children are full citizens. So full citizenship skips the enslaved generation, but the next generation is just as Roman legally as the last. So let's talk about how this impacted foreign policy, but I've already hinted at some of this. This fellow on the left, so this guy here, Mithridates VI, was native to a kingdom along the Black Sea region in what's modern-day Georgia, and it was called Pontus. And he's that guy who one day decided, it probably took him a while, but he noticed Romans taking up a lot of real estate that used to be independent in the Eastern Mediterranean, and he's probably coming for my kingdom next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a no Romans policy. And I'm not just going to kick all of the Romans out, I'm going to kill them. So one night, he tells all of his military, like, look, on such and such a date, wake up in the morning, kill all the Romans. All of them. Men, women, children, everybody. And then Rome decided that it was going to make a big deal out of this. They were like, okay, A, this is on a scale where this is super insulting, and B, we're going to make this a test case for Roman citizen rights abroad. So we're going to tell Mithridates, even though we don't have an existing treaty as such, that Roman citizen rights guarantee you a right to not be murdered. So we are going to avenge them by going to war with you, Mithridates, which is what Rome does. Asterisk. There's a little bit of an administrative hiccup because at the time the consul, who's Gaius Marius, again, that's his consulship in 87, he retired and then he came back. He was like, no, I like power. I'm going to run for office again. He gets it. But by now there's another general who's been recruiting his own damn troops for the last couple of decades. And this general, Sulla, goes to war with Marius over who gets to be in charge of the war against Mithridates, which is one of the most bananas excuses for a civil war, right? Who the hell goes to civil war over who gets to be in charge of a foreign war? But this is what Rome does. And it works because we now have two armies, both of them fanatically loyal to their general, not necessarily the Roman state, and willing to fight to the death against other Romans for their general. Sulla wins this one. His nickname is Lucky, and you'll see why in a minute. And he manages to fight Mithridates to a standstill and then negotiate a treaty. Mithridates lives through this and continues to be king for another couple of decades. There's a second war with Mithridates. That's when they finally take him out. But in part, they leave him there because Rome is in such a mess at the time. There isn't time to do the whole job. Sometimes Mithridates gets compared a little bit to ancient Saddam Hussein if you're going for an American-centric kind of reading of Roman history. I don't know how well it obtains, but it might help you remember this guy. So that is one approach of a foreign king to the rise of Rome. That is the zero tolerance, no Romans, not ever approach. Ultimately, it doesn't go great for Mithridates. Rome conquers Pontus, and Rome makes it into a province. So that didn't work. So let's look at another approach then to dealing with Rome encroaching on your territory. And for this, we're going to meet someone from a little bit later in the century. This is Ptolemy the 12th, whose nickname is Auletes, which means it's sometimes translated flute player, but it's not a flute. It's more like imagine if you have two oboes and you play them at once. That's the aulos. Really loud, it's a party instrument. It's sort of like an electric guitar, socially speaking. It's like a cool guy instrument, but it's not a particularly dignified instrument. Maybe sort of like Bill Clinton and the saxophone. That might be an aging reference. At any rate, so Ptolemy went hard for Roman friendship. He was the Ptolemaic king of Egypt, and he had access to a huge amount of wealth and resources. Now, by this point, Other Hellenistic kingdoms had fallen one by one to Roman encroachment. Egypt was one of the last ones left standing still under Greek-speaking rule. And in order to maintain independence against Rome that was eyeing Egypt very hungrily because of its grain surpluses. Rome was having trouble producing enough grain to feed the city of Rome, let alone the Italian peninsula, because so many people were living there at this point. So Ptolemy started giving them grain at a discount and throwing lavish parties, and he formed a particularly close relationship with the Roman general who ends up taking out Mithridates, a guy named Pompey the Great. They're bros. They go to the same parties together, and Ptolemy makes Pompey the executor of his will. In other words, Ptolemy is in charge of making sure that the kingdom goes to the right one of Ptolemy the 12th's children, of which he has 4 who are throne adjacent. There is his daughter Cleopatra the 7th of Egypt, who is that Cleopatra. This is Cleopatra's dad. There's also her sister Arsinoe, the younger sister, and then there are 2 little boys who are much younger, and they end up dead. Let's gloss over that because it's depressing. So Ptolemy did everything he could to make nice with the Romans, and for a while it did kind of work. Rome let him rule autonomously, even though he was outside of his country for most of this time. He was able to pass his kingdom down to his children after there's like a civil war. It was nasty, but Cleopatra VII then was in charge for several more decades afterwards. But this is also a country that eventually becomes a Roman province. Despite Egypt's best efforts to collaborate and cooperate with Rome, Egypt too eventually gets on the wrong side of a Roman civil war and ends up becoming a Roman province. So 2 very different ways of dealing with Roman expansion. One of them very resistant, another one of them very collaborative, and both of them ultimately kind of fruitless. And I'm not saying resistance is never the best policy. I'm also saying, though, that appeasement is no guarantee of safety. It may postpone the misery for a while, but it's ultimately not a great sustainable strategy. So here is a map of the greater Mediterranean, including the Mithridatic Alliance, just to give you an idea of what kind of land Mithridates controlled. So here in the green, I'm circling it in red, you'll see the kingdom of Pontus, including Galatia and Cappadocia, and it also included part of what's now southern Ukraine as part of its allied states. So this was a Black Sea alliance that had a pretty good chance at holding Rome off because the Black Sea was remote, it was hard to get at, it was hard to invade for many reasons, in part though because the Pontics had access to some bioweapons. Now these might not sound kind of like bioweapons, but they were a good growing ground for aconite. You may have heard of it as either monk's hood or wolfsbane. This is a very poisonous plant, and bees that feed off of it create honey that's also like hallucinogenic and poisonous. So what they would do, because the Roman army ate basically pancakes with honey on them, they just make sure that the special honey was in the path of the Roman army as it was coming through, and then everybody would have horrible diarrhea and Mithridates could pounce. It worked out well until it didn't. Meanwhile, the Ptolemies are here, and eventually they also hold the Cyrenaica and parts of Cyprus until they don't, but that's not until the 40s. So here's another example of Roman foreign policy and patronage and how that works out. This time in Judea. This, in some ways, is a better case scenario even than what Egypt and the Ptolemies had going on with Rome, in part because Judea during this point, Rome was considered an ally against Greek-speaking oppression. So the Greek speakers of the Seleucid Empire, led by Antiochus IV, some of you may be familiar with this. This is the Hanukkah thing. Antiochus IV kicks off what is essentially a genocidal suppression of local religion in the part of his kingdom that compromises Judea. The Maccabees lead a revolt that successfully drives the Antiochids out of what later becomes the independent kingdom of Judea. But part of how they do this is they make a mutual defense treaty with Rome. Rome at this point is beginning to develop a lot of allies in the region, and they're like, you know what? Rome is not a Greek speaker. They're very different. They say they'll let us have our religious freedom. We believe them. We are going to make a deal. And it works out really well for a while. Rome guarantees Judean independence. It helps to secure succession amongst the dynasties that come out of this war. So first the Hasmoneans and then the Herodians. And these ties are really strong for several generations, but not forever. But just to give you an idea of what this looks like in practice. So everything that I've got outlined in blue here are Jewish names. So that's the first couple of generations of the Hasmonean dynasty are people with names like John and Judas Maccabeus. And is Eleazar Maccabeus on here? Yeah, there he is. Poor Eleazar. He dies squished by an elephant, but he kills the elephant. It's a whole thing. There's fan art of this. Just Google Eleazar Maccabeus and you get all this medieval fan art. If you like that kind of thing. The elephant looks very confused. Anyway, once we get to the green, we start seeing people born into this dynasty with Greek names, in part because Greek is still the language of international diplomacy, and they're still plugging into this Greek Near Eastern network without changing their religion. They're just kind of leaning into a more moderate Greek adjacent identity. But by the time we get down into the last generation, in red, you'll notice Agrippa I and Agrippa II, named for their Roman godfather, Agrippa. It's a Roman name. And then you'll notice there aren't any more. I guess it didn't work. Well, okay, so one last. I don't want to leave you on a downer. So here's one more story of friendly kings. Sometimes you'll hear the word client king for kings who cooperated in some way or had normalized diplomatic relationships with Rome. Those are modern terms. Romans, when they were talking about this relationship, they called them friendly kings, or kings that are our friends. And a part of how you get to be a friendly king, sometimes you're raised in a Roman household as a foster child, a little bit like, what's his face, Theon Greyjoy or something, only less depressing. Actually, no, it's pretty depressing. We'll be talking about these folks in a minute. And they do start in a very depressing place that is exactly that. But you're educated in Rome either because you've been kidnapped as a child or you're sent as a hostage for good behavior back home. So Romans call this friendly, but I hope you don't kidnap your friends' children and make them live with you so that they like you. Please don't do that. That's toxic. And also, you have to babysit a lot if you do that. So don't. Mostly because it's evil, but also it seems impractical. Anyway, so let's talk about this couple. Juba II was the heir to the throne of Mauritania when it was part of an uprising against Rome. He was kidnapped as a baby, probably an infant, so less than a year old, and he was marched through the streets of Rome in a triumph as a baby, which is just so messed up. Then he was raised in the city of Rome, educated as a Roman, and as soon as he was old enough, he was sent back to Mauritania. Rome apparently didn't want to govern Mauritania directly, so they're like, okay, Juba, we can trust you. You're our guy. We raised you. I'm sure you're really grateful for us for not killing you. So you go back to Mauritania, and you're the king now. His wife had a similar story. Cleopatra Selene was the daughter of Cleopatra VII of Egypt and Mark Antony. She was one of a pair of twins. Her brother Alexander Helios died in childhood. She was kidnapped as a young child, so 4 years old, and marched in chains through the streets of Rome as part of a triumph, much like Juba. They were so little, her and her brother Alexander, that they were too little to carry the chains, and they kept tripping, and the crowds were like, oh shit, this is fucked up. Which is, it kind of backfired on the triumphing general at the time, which was Augustus. She was raised by Augustus's sister, also Mark Antony's legal wife, which is an interesting move, but apparently this was a decent enough household. So she was also educated in Rome, and a marriage was arranged between her and Juba. So they get married, they go to be king and queen of Mauritania. Because they've been raised in Rome, they have a lot of trust, especially Cleopatra. She was kind of sort of related to the current dynasty of the first emperor in the imperial family. She'd been raised in their household. They knew her. They knew Juba. They were kind of like family. And they used this trust they had with Rome to create a safe space for scholars fleeing Egypt, people who no longer wanted to live under Roman rule and wanted a safe place to live their lives, went to the court in Mauritania. And Juba and Cleopatra used their friendly king and queen status to protect them, including a lot of people who knew Cleopatra's mother, Cleopatra. They put a lot of Egyptian art in their palace, and they made it kind of this Pan-African haven. Juba II, Cleopatra as well, they were both really nerdy. Juba, however, was extra nerdy. He was an environmental scientist and ecologist who wrote several monographs on the flora, fauna, and geography of North Africa. He led mapping expeditions into the Atlas Mountains, and he was also an expert on the biology of elephants. So pretty nifty dude, Juba II. Both of them died what appears to be a natural death, at which point their kingdom did cede to Rome. But this is kind of a best case scenario, and I think they're super romantic, so you're just going to have to go with my fan fiction here. They seem to have been kind of happy, and they made a life out of a really shitty beginning, and their horrible backstory made them into people who tried to make a safer world for folks like them, which, there's a lot of bad news in this course, but this is not it. They're cool. Also, this is my cat, Juba. Isn't he cute? He's got black toe beans. Look at that. On his little white paws, he's got black toe beans. That's so cool. He's got a little heart on his shoulder. She's so cute. That's Kato. Yeah, Kato's kind of I think Tethys might be in the background or somewhere. But yeah, he's so squishy. He's really fat. Squishy. Yeah, and he sleeps in my arms like a little doll. I love him. I mean, I love all my cats. But yes, so he's Juba, my friendly king. He's not on the test, but isn't he cute? So cute! So relevant. Not relevant at all, but cute. At any rate, Juba II of Mauritania is one of my favorite people, and I hope you like him too now, and go tell a friend, because African nerd king. So cool! And he married Cleopatra's daughter, who was also a nerd. Nerd couple. Nerd power couple. So nifty. Oh God. All right. I'm back. Right. What are we talking about? Yes. Okay. From that to Roman xenophobia. So we've been talking about how people increasingly forced to live in Rome's world dealt with the encroaching reality of Roman power on their front doorstep. But let's talk for a minute about what this suddenly cosmopolitan world was doing to Roman people who are trying to come up with ways to figure out what the hell is happening here. Because for a lot of Romans, they had a difficult time dealing with international politics because there was a general attitude that Romans weren't fully civilized. They weren't properly cultured. They're not Greek. they're not even Egyptians. Like, Egyptians kind of get a pass because they're considered to be an older culture than Greeks by Greeks. So Egyptians have sort of this, ooh, you're a very old culture. But Rome doesn't even have that. And they're not Greek speakers either. So to Greeks, Romans are just like these random barbarians, no different from Celts, which to Romans is like, oh, we are totally different from Celts. And Greeks are like, how? They're like, stab. At any rate, there are a couple of ways that Romans deal with this. Some Romans decided to kind of buy into this Greek narrative, saying, oh, you know, actually we are Greeks. You'll notice there are a lot of Greek speakers living in Italy. Yeah, we're the descendants of the heroes of the Trojan War on the Greek side, and we're actually really Greek. You just can't tell. There are other Romans who are like, F you, Greece. We're from the Trojan side. Yeah, that's right. We're in the epic tradition, but we're on the other side, and we're back for vengeance because we don't like you. Which is also a very interesting way to connect yourself to the pan-Mediterranean epic tradition, but on we go. So I've got two examples of cranky Romans dealing with their own feelings of inferiority. I'm actually going to start with the fellow on the right. So this here is a portrait of Augustus, who ends up being the first emperor of Rome. He's the one who invests heavily in this, we are the descendants of the Trojans thing, and buys into this idea that, okay, so we can take a lot of Greek culture from the Greeks and we can make it better by like flipping the script. So we're part of the epic tradition, but we're Trojans. And we are civilized, but we're not like Greek civilized, we're better. We're like a different kind of civilized because we have more self-control and we don't do the luxury thing. Which is an interesting way to go with this, but okay. And we'll be talking about this a lot more when we read the Aeneid and then Augustus's Res Gestae. So he's kind of our next author. So we're going to look back a little bit. This is that Roman portrait that's sometimes associated with Cato the Elder. This isn't actually Cato the Elder. It's just a cranky old Roman, but you can see why people think that's Cato, yes. You've read him now. You have a feeling. Anyway, so Cato the Elder had some interesting things to say about about Greeks. And here we go. I'm going to narrate them for you while you look at my adorable kitty, who is not the real Cato, but he's much cuter. And he only hates it when you hug him and don't ask. So, anyway. This is the dramatic reading portion of the lecture. This is a letter that Cato the Elder wrote to his son Marcus. So this isn't in the piece that you read. Apparently he's the kind of guy who writes like long advice emails to his kid, saves them, and publishes them. Because of course he does. So anyway, imagine that you're his kid and you're getting this letter. Here we go. All right. About those dratted Greeks, my son Marcus, I will impart to you what I gleaned in my studies in Athens, and that, although it is good to dabble in their literature, one shouldn't embrace it wholeheartedly. I will dismiss their useless and intractable tribe, and be sure I speak as a prophet when I say this. Whenever that tribe will give us their literature, they will destroy everything, and even more so if it sends us its physicians. They have sworn against themselves to kill all barbarians with medicine, but they accomplish this very thing while getting paid in order to gain our trust and easily destroy us. They also make a habit of calling us barbarians and besmirch us more than others with the name Opikoi. I forbid you to have anything to do with physicians. One of my favorite unhinged rants from antiquity. But there are a couple of things here that are worth highlighting in this revealing diatribe. Also, keep in mind, Cato the Elder is not personally, at least partly responsible for the mass enslavement of a bunch of Greek speakers. So, like, this is an interesting look. Notice how he mentions he studied in Athens. That's true. He basically went to college to study abroad in Athens, Greece. So he himself had a Greek education. And it's a bit of a flex that he mentions this. He's like, I'm not ignorant. I know what those Greeks think. I went to school in Greece. I know about Greeks. And you know what? They're evil. So it's a bit of an interesting balance. We also notice that even though he's pretty anti-Greek, he does refer to several Greek sources on agriculture as well. So he might be protesting a little bit too much. He does seem to be kind of familiar with Greek science. The other interesting note is that he kind of goes hard against physicians in particular, which might seem like a really interesting move. Like, why are we so freaked out about Greek physicians? Well, one of the major changes in the social landscape of Rome during this period was an increasing reliance on Greek science, especially medical science, and for Greek scientists acting as physicians. This is something that had traditionally been the purview of upper-class Romans. Upper-class Romans were expected to oversee the health of their household as pater familias, and getting in a Greek ringer to come in and be the doctor for your household was considered a little sketchy, a little newfangled, a little Greek. And Cato's worry here is that, again, I think this probably hurt more Greeks than it did Romans, but he's worried that they're going to try to kill us all. Keep in mind, a lot of the Greek physicians who are coming into Rome at this period are not coming voluntarily. Some of them are. Some of them are immigrants coming in to start a private practice in the city of Rome. Most of them are prisoners of war, enslaved and forced to serve as physicians in the household of the Romans who just destroyed their home. This is not a recipe for medical trust. I think we can all agree, yes? Please don't enslave your doctor. It's just a recipe for bad medical treatment. But it informs some of what Cato's saying here, and part of why he's so particularly worried about Greek physicians is I think he, A, can't really understand why they're doing the treatments they're doing, and he's also worried that they're secretly trying to kill you. And this, considering what ancient medicine looks like, I can see where you would get to that place. It's not as bad as you might think, but still there's a lot of bleeding and questionable surgical procedures happening, so it's not a great practice context for this to happen in. But this is worth thinking about, not so much because we should sit inside Cato's head and view his paranoid landscape, but it's really revealing about the kinds of attitudes that you would encounter if you were kidnapped from your Greek-speaking home, transported into a Roman household, trafficked, and then forced to live amongst people who think things like this about you, who have this weird inferiority complex and are projecting it onto you, but are also trafficking you because you're fancy and educated. That's what kind of keeps me up at night and makes me feel really chilly about this. But it's also important to keep in mind when we look at Roman foreign policy and the way they're thinking about immigration, naturalization, and citizenship during this period, because we forget the role of conquest and enslavement in that process at our peril, and it makes us miss some of the more problematic social dynamics in play. Another thing that I put out here is that this is an attitude that serves both Romans and the people who have to live in their world increasingly particularly ill, and it's something that we see softening on as time goes on, but at the cost of increased buy-in to Roman identity and Roman ways of thinking. And this is something we're going to see Romans kind of dealing with and encountering, especially Romans who aren't the most elite Romans, Romans who have to fight in these wars, Romans who are finding it increasingly difficult to get jobs because of the role of enslavement in the workforce. and Romans who are having to deal with an international community that doesn't like them very much because they're, mass murdering oppressors. Well, that's not the best sentence to end on, but that's kind of what I've got for you at this point. I think the next slide is starting into a more internal talk. So the rest of this lecture is much less imperialism gone amok. From here, this is going to be about what is the patron-client system? What are the rights? What are the responsibilities? How does it work? And it's an important rule system to keep in mind because it's going to inform social dynamics moving ahead as we get more into Roman social dynamics, especially gendered dynamics. So don't neglect the already reading. Watch lecture 6A as well. It's a companion to this one. And have a wonderful spring break. Do something nice for yourself. Do something nice for somebody else. Have a lovely rest, and I'll see you when you get back. Oh, thank you. So, yes.
After every class, I always me and my friends or texting them immediately after me guys, guess what I learned today? And they're just not again.
Yes.
I thought you would love that note. So
I love that.
I just tell them about one good couple on the entire
day. Tell them about Judah and Cleopatra. People need to know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right,
so
everybody.
I didn't get this.
Yeah, make sure you get this. Get credit. It's important. Oh, wait. I need to stop recording this.